This is from a chapter in the book that Scott Brooks and I wrote in 2016, Creating the Vital Organization, and we'd like to expand on this book chapter today with you. Let me welcome you. My name is Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of Org Vitality, and our presenter today is going to be Scott Brooks. Scott and I wrote this book 2016, as I mentioned, and as we've gone through the book, we've been asked lots and lots of questions about, how does the book actually get implemented day to day in organizational practice? And so we've taken chunks of the book and have expanded on it. And today we're going to expand, or Scott's going to expand, on the chapter about innovation in the organization and how to protect it. Just a few housekeeping issues before we get started. First off, you'll see on your screen there's a place, a chat box or a question box, and we'll be monitoring both of those. And if you have any questions as we go, just enter them in there and we'll save some time at the end to answer any of the questions you have. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a short survey that we'd love if you would complete for us, and it will ask some simple questions about is the length of the survey, the time of the survey, etc. Does it meet your needs? And third, everybody will get a copy of the slides after the webinar concludes. So as long as you registered for the webinar and put in your email address, we'll ship you a copy of today's slides. So let me tell you a little bit about Scott. I've been working with Scott for quite some time now. Probably we've been working very closely for the last 10 years, and I think I've known of Scott and his work for probably maybe 15 to 20 years, and I've always been very impressed. And I think you will be too, because when Scott presents on topics like this, no matter how many times you've heard him, there's always a new nugget or a new insight that can be gained. So I always enjoy listening to Scott present, and I always, even though I co-authored the book with him, I always get some interesting new nugget out of conversations with him. So that's about Scott, and let me go to the book, right? The next slide. This is a little more detail about the book that Scott and I wrote together. And one of the interesting things I think in the book is that at the end of each chapter, there's actually an assessment that the reader can take to say either how well is my organization doing or how well am I doing on the content of this particular chapter. And there are a similar kind of assessment at the end of the innovation chapter in the book as well. So the book's still available on Amazon, and if you want more information about it, you can check it out online. So thank you. And so without further ado, let me turn the session over to Scott Brooks.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So, the book here you can see is about a vital organization, and what is that about? What is vitality? And that's really at the core of what innovation is and means. So let me step back for a minute and describe it. So think about your to-do list, and it's here stacked up. Maybe it's your team's to-do list or your division's to-do list or your organization's objectives for the year. You've clearly got stuff to do. You got customers to serve, you got money to make. Maybe you have papers to push around. Now, the weight of this list will typically deal with what we're calling current performance. It's all about what needs to happen today. It's execution through existing processes or existing approaches or existing methods. Now, there are also, probably you have some improvement ambitions. And while they may be small, they're probably mighty. And these are your goals or your ambitions or your interest in creating things that do not yet exist. Whether it's that you do it or your team is looking for something, your division, your organization, there's always something about trying to invent the future. And you can step back and say, all right, how much have you done on this end of the teeter-totter this week? Small, maybe? but it's critical to find your balance, and it's hard. And this is what we call future potential. And part of the struggle here is that the day-to-day current performance concerns can overwhelm the future potential. And vitality, actually, the way we define it in the book and the way we're talking about it in terms of innovation here, is a dynamic balance. It's how do you simultaneously streamline current performance and build future potential. And by the way, side note, if you're academically minded, it's a mouthful, but the search term to look for is something called organizational ambidexterity. That is exactly all about the simultaneous pursuit of execution, which is current performance, and exploration, which is future potential. Now, this balance is really what's the challenge of innovation. And we can step back and give you some data. Employees describe this challenge. This is information from our normative database. And we've got two items here, and you can look at the percent favorable. 81% of employees say that they're encouraged to innovate and to come up with new ideas. That's great. That's 81% of everybody that we've ever surveyed, and on this kind of item, representing all kinds of job families, all kinds of geographies, all kinds of types of people. That's high, and almost so high as to not be meaningful. On the other hand, the capacity to act on new ideas, only about half the people say they have that. That's a 26-point difference, 1/4 of the entire possible scale. And what all this means is that in organizations, there's a lot of talk. Oh, sure, yeah, come up with ideas, great, do it. But there's not a lot of implementation. And that's what this says. So we have this struggle, we have this challenge. What are we going to do about it? Well, we Google, of course. And if you were to just Google, in 0.58 seconds, you would get virtually 1/4 billion things to read and to figure out what to do. It's like, okay, that's interesting. If you look at the ways that we Google for innovation, or the term business innovation would also work and show the same thing, you get this cyclical pattern. There's natural rhythms that start to peak through the fall, and then there's this hiatus that we're coming up with in the last week of the year. That's that dip. And this is the season we're entering. So this is the perfect time to step back, reflect, and to start to make some New Year's resolutions about how you're going to work on innovation. So we dive in. As Jeff mentioned, this is a chapter in the book. Technically, it's chapter 6. And the deal of today is we get to skip the first 5 chapters and just walk through chapter 6. And you know, maybe if we leave you hanging for chapter 7, you could shoot me a note and I can give you some spoilers. But let's go through chapter 6. First question. I have a poll for all of you, and let me call it up here. So, when people say innovation, is there a consistent meaning? And this is when people say innovation in your organization. So, please take a moment and click on an answer. Okay, answers are starting to come in. All right. There we go. About half of you voted. I think some of you can muster a vote here. All right. Well, we're going to close the poll. So let me share the results. Basically, almost half of everybody says not at all. And maybe a third say we talk and make some progress. But there's, you know, relatively small numbers that actually work on things or say they agree, at least to some extent, and nobody says they completely agree. That's pretty typical. What I want to do here is step back and say, what does innovation mean? And when people say innovation, what do they mean? And here's a picture of a classic Rorschach ink blot test, because that's kind of what it is. A lot of times people say innovation, and it's just whatever it is that makes things better is innovation. So, do people mean the same thing? Do they have the same vision of how it unfolds? Do they carry the same baggage? So let's move past this ink blot test into a little bit of clarity. So the first statement is that the innovation is the creation of something both new and useful. This is really important because you can't just come up with a great idea that's a little different. It has to be something that's put into play. And so that's the first sort of sub-bullet. This is not just about creativity. If you measure or think about innovation, you cannot stop at being creative. Creative environments are not synonymous with innovative environments. Innovative environments take a certain amount of creativity and put it to work. And then the second thing that we want to say is that this is not just about products. A lot of times people think about innovation and it's just innovating in a product or something tangible like a technological doodad or widget. But it can be about services. You can innovate in terms of methods and styles. You can innovate in how you deal with relationships, and it can certainly be internal or external. So let's not think about this as necessarily the next big product or service that your company offers. It can be something a little closer to home, wherever your home happens to be. So some further definition. We're going to talk about little I innovation and big I innovation. Little I innovation is about improving current performance and basically working within your paradigm or within your schema or within your existing processes and approaches. And big I innovation is about building future potential, right? Or making something that just has not been made before. And some characteristics. Both are truly can be innovation, but little I is incremental change, big I is breakthrough. Little I is focused on existing products and services, and big I is about, tends to be more about creating new products or services. Little I, addressing defined problems. Big I follows a creative, playful exploration. You may not know exactly where you're going. You got within paradigm versus paradigm busting. One that requires time, attention, resources, and the other requires significant, often unknown amounts of time, attention, and resources. You will note, and this is covered in sort of a different, it'd be a different topic for a different webinar, but SMART goals are really tough to apply to big I innovation. How do I know what's achievable, what's measurable, what's realistic, and what's kind of time bound I want to make it? In little I innovation, it's difficult to maintain efforts and keeping your foot on the gas to improve. And for big I innovation, it's very difficult to maintain or even start certain kinds of efforts. And so this actually is the core theme of the book, whether it's a little I or a big I, the balance of current performance and building future potential. And each side is tackled differently. For example, you can think of all kinds of programs about improving little I innovation or current performance, even dating back. You've got total quality management, TQM, you've got lean, you've got business processes engineering, you've got Six Sigma kinds of things, you have whatever sort of label you're giving this kind of thing today. Those typically are about streamlining current performance, not necessarily breakthrough exploration. And on the other side, building future potential kind of defies programs, right? It's hard to create a program or a system or a schedule that actually creates it. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but let me pause for a second and launch another poll. I have a goal this time of greater than 50% response rate. I think we can do this. So please answer the poll. What is your innovation challenge? Are you coming in today thinking mostly about improving current performance? Are you talking about building future potential, both about the same, or maybe neither? Innovation just isn't a challenge. Okay, give it some thought. Give it some more time. All right. Looking for one more person. If you haven't voted, just make a vote and we'll close the polls. All right, closing the polls. Interestingly, the results sort of speak for themselves. Both about the same, is maybe not quite half of everybody, but then everybody else is evenly split between the little I and the big I innovation. I think that's kind of interesting, that the innovation scheme that we have and that we have to talk about needs to cover both. And I think it is important to cover both separately because they are different, they act different. So let me get into some advice here. First is an advice from a great organizational scientist, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as the former president of the United States. And he highlights a key point, is do something. If it works, do more of it. If it doesn't, do something else. And, you know, this is a key point that innovation doesn't always work. And you have to step back, rework, and try something else. So what is needed? What are requirements for, in this case, big I innovation? We're going to focus here. Big I innovation is harder, not just incremental improvements. So first, we need to know that building future potential is, by definition, exploring the unknown. This brings attempts, failure, learnings, hopefully, and repetition in order to figure it out. This requires a tolerance for risk, and maybe more sinister, perhaps, a tolerance for inefficiency. If you ask people, it's like, if I'm going to try to invent, you know, the light bulb, am I going to fail a bunch of times? People go, oh yeah, you know, failure's part of it, but just be efficient about it. And that is something that is a little more subtler, and you just have to plan for and expect inefficiency. Also requires slack resources, and the implication here is that 100% optimized systems cannot tolerate the risk needed for breakthrough operations. What does that mean? That means that if you are operating at peak capacity and peak efficiency, you have no room to risk any kind of inefficiency. You have no room to risk error. You can't, if there's no tolerance for failure, if there's no tolerance for inefficiencies, you just cannot accommodate big I innovation. And innovation you can think of as an investment. And like other investments in resource-strapped environments, it needs special attention and protection. Just sort of one quick side story. In my first job that I had out of graduate school, if I were sitting back in my chair at my desk and staring up into space, people would assume that I was wasting time. At my job that I got after that, which was a little more fit for me and a guy like me, if I was leaning back in my chair staring off into space, people would assume I was working. And I think that's part of this tolerance for apparent inefficiencies, or a tolerance for really just stepping back and thinking. As it happens, by the way, of course, I was working when I was leaning back in my chair and staring off into space. So if we're talking about protection, though, how do we protect innovation? We can ask, where does innovation come from? Let's start with organizational structure. Now, you may have a structure that looks something like this, and let's assume that maybe the second box from the left in the middle row is new ventures, or research and development, or product development. You know, how does that fit in, or how does it tie in with everything else? Well, let's say, for example, that you are USA Today back in 1995, and you're trying to figure out how to adapt to this newfangled internet thing. How do you support your organization? Now, it turns out there's been some research on organizational structure. And the first thing we do is we look at different kinds of structure. Here's a functional design, right? So how do you innovate? And maybe you have a project team set up to explore internet news delivery. And so functional design is you have a general manager, manufacturing, sales, R&D, something like that, and you try to integrate your project team into an existing management structure. All right, that's fine. Hold that thought for a second. Second is you have a cross-functional team kind of design. Let's say that you create a task force that's created based on people from manufacturing or operations and sales and R&D, and you create this emerging businesses task force to sort of explore what is happening. That's fine. That's useful to know, but that's not those people's day jobs. What about what you might call an unsupported team, which is something completely outside the established organization management hierarchy, something just on the side? And that's where you might have a special group put together where they're sort of maybe a little disconnected and off to the side. And then the last might be what actually O'Reilly and Tushman in their research on organizational ambidexterity called it ambidextrous organization, where you have structurally independent units with their own processes, structures, and cultures, yet integrated into the management hierarchy, right? So they're connected at the top. So question here is, according to this research, which organizational design seemed to work better when you are trying to create sort of a new and emerging business? And the answer is this this ambidextrous organization, where 90% of the organizations that use this design met their goals. And if you're wondering about the other groups, the functional design in the upper left, a quarter of those designs met their goals. And for the other two designs, 0 met their goals. So this is one study, but it's illustrative. And what can we learn from this? If we were to step back and say, what are the big messages from this? Number one, it is important to have a buffer from the day-to-day realities so that those involved with developing and implementing future potential can focus, right? That's this ambidextrous organization in the orange. There is an orange separation. Second, it's absolutely critical to maintain an executive level sponsorship and involvement to connect what this side group is doing to strategy and priorities. This is absolutely critical, and it's one of the things that's missing, let's say, from the just create a task force kind of thing. And you need to enable the right kind of boundary spanning to cross-pollinate, share resources, stay calibrated to the most important stakeholder. This isn't as reflected in that org chart, sort of slide on the other page. But you have to make sure that people stay connected to reality. One tiny version of this is you make R&D engineers do ride-alongs with salespeople just so that they stay connected to what the marketplace is saying and not just dream their dreamy visions inside sub-basement floor. So these are the biggest lessons from this org structure research. And one, by the way, a quick note on a very big topic. Acquisitions are the effort to buy innovation. They're kind of like an extreme case of a buffered structure where you step back and you let other people percolate on ideas, and then once they hit something that can align with your structure and your needs and your strategy, then you buy them. That's a whole, again, other separate conversation, but you could think about acquisitions as sort of a very extreme way to get new innovations and products and so forth and so on. Now, this is just one way to do it that looks at very big sort of organizational wide kind of things, but that's not always the way innovation happens. Let me do a special note quickly about innovation labs, by the way. This is very sort of popular and compelling kind of description. You think of Google Labs. Most of us probably remember Google Labs. They generated a host of products that are used by millions. Different Gmail kinds of things came out of them. But they shuttered Google Labs in 2011. And the reason was they needed greater focus. And in fact, CEO Larry Page at the time said, we need more wood behind fewer arrows, right? That's like shooting bigger arrows, not the whatever the shotgun version of archery would be. And in fact, the SVP at the time for research and systems infrastructure, Bill Cochran, said, while we've learned a huge amount by launching very early prototypes, greater focus is crucial. What this was like an unsupported team. It was not connected to the top. It was not connected to where they really wanted to go. Google Labs eventually transformed into Google X, launched in mid-2014 with a focus on a few but audacious projects like self-driving cars and the internet balloon network kinds of things and so forth. Other organizations have fairly famously dealt with other sort of garage labs kinds of things. Many are secretive in terms of exactly what they do and how they work, but the lesson from this is that they cannot just be free-floating, disconnected from what the organization cares about. They can be buffered from day-to-day realities of the rest of the organization, but they need to stay connected. They need to have that boundary spanning, as mentioned before. Now, if you, in your situation right now, let's say you can't mess around with organizational structure and maybe you can't create the buffers and things like that on a massive scale, what can you do? What are some other protection kinds of efforts? Organizational structure is big picture for big efforts and implementing big changes, right? But we can draw upon similar concepts of buffering time and resources with some example programs that might require less of an organizational overhaul and no doubt will cause some of you to think about other things that you might do in your own jobs. And these are going to be in the spirit of some of the original greats. Thomas Edison famously said, to invent, you need a good imagination and a pile of junk. And we would add, a little bit of time to sit around and play in a way that's connected to what the organization needs, right? So how do you unleash this kind of a thing? Well, let's walk through that list of 4 things. The first was split time. This is well known as Google's 20% time. Typically, 10 to 20% of the time you might sort of set aside as available for creative exploration. And the impact of this, it is easy to find journalistic stories that say this is great, this is awesome, and it's generated lots of things. It certainly sounds good. It's basically free product development, and maybe you only need 1 or 2 big wins to make it worth it, right? So yeah, sure. I mean, there can be some good to this, but what's required for this to be successful is a supportive culture and climate to slack resources. This is key. How do you define 20% if you're overworked already? I don't have a poll question to say how many of you feel overworked or that you're working at pretty close to capacity, but show of hands, yep, okay, all of you feel pretty much overworked. So now what's 20% of your time from that, or how does that get created? And you need to have this well focused on the kind of employee that can balance this kind of demand. Not all employees take to ambiguity or lack of structure or have sort of a creative spark to drive them forward to something new. That's actually a different chapter in the book that talks about different kinds of employees that are good at innovation. But know that there are some people who might be called explorers, some people that might be executors, and other kinds of people that might be called boundary spanners. It's a very, very interesting way to carve this up. But you definitely need for this to work some check-ins to help structure ambiguity. So not without limitations and a little hard to actually implement and not just talk about. So what else we got? Well, here's another one, a Blitz Day. Blitz Day is a concept actually taken from labor unions in the United States, where they would try to make a blitz run to unionize an organization. But one healthcare organization took that and transformed its original purpose into something new. They had ambassadors who fanned out across the whole organization to greet every employee who came to work that day. Now this was several cities, happened to be within Colorado inside the United States. And to this day, they insist that they got to everybody who came to work. And what these ambassadors did, and they were executives, they were some union leaders, they were some folks from human resources. They handed out a piece of candy and a card that read, "Think of one idea to improve patient care or service and discuss it with your work group. And then they moved on, right? So they didn't do a lot to bog it down. They just did this. Now, what was the impact? As I mentioned, they claimed that every employee was greeted. That's great. More importantly, I think it created a huge buzz and created stories that told themselves. And it was all consistent with values and strategy and what the organization was working on. And what it did is it gave perfect license for employees who had ideas to sort of go back and talk about people. It gave license to brainstorm and chat about new kinds of things and ideas. And this was so effective with generating and sharing great ideas that they repeated it on a national scale a couple years later with a new topic of patient safety, which obviously is critical for a healthcare organization. This does create a shared culture that's defined. It's easy, I'm going to put easy in air quotes here, to have an adaptation of this where, let's say the CEO gets up early and stands by the front door of whatever building you've got and greets everybody who comes into work that day and does something similar. That would be the kind of thing that people talk about for a long time. And if the CEO is saying, think of a great idea, you know, and tell your boss, maybe email it to this email, here's a card, here's a bagel, let's go. That is not a very difficult, challenging thing to do in concept. It might be hard for a CEO to spend a whole day doing that, but it pays off. Anyway, so that's a Blitz Day kind of idea where you try to do something audacious in one day. How about innovation competitions? You may be aware there's a lot of competitions out there. DARPA, which in the United States is a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, they have contests in robotics. Frito-Lay has a chip flavor contest where you could submit what's your good flavor of chip that they should make. I'm going to describe here a little bit more of Career Builder has an example of ideas from everywhere. Now, what is this? This is where employees submit ideas and create a business plan. This is not just a quick thing. This is a 6-month process where if you're going for it, you're assigned a leader for guidance. They have templates and support, and it's not just for technology, although that's where a lot of the activity tends to be, because that's what they are. But HR, frontline, new employees, anybody can throw their hat in the ring and do this. And so what happens? Well, up to 50 submissions every year are reviewed. Top 10 gets to present it to top management. The winners may get resources to help to develop this into a full project. There are products that exist today because of this program. And actually, it's not always the winners that are the products that wind up making their way into mainstream, but sometimes the runners up. But the idea is that this is big, it's organizationally sponsored, it comes back in cycles. It has a cyclical rhythm to it. So if I have an idea one year, I don't have to bake it all in. I can think and see and learn about how things are successful here, and then work it in the next year. So cycles and rhythms here is one of the points I want to emphasize from this one. How about the next on the list was a hackathon. Some of you may have heard about this. What is it? Typically, it's a 24-hour period where you are released from your typical job duties. This is kind of like the buffer from the day-to-day that is a part of one of the themes here, where individuals or teams can work on pet projects or whatever. The organization might provide support or food or games for 24 hours. They might bring in pizza. Sometimes there's music. The executives can get silly. There's always plenty of coffee. And it concludes with some sort of informal show and tell, right? Now, this is really a free play time to generate things. That's not necessarily with a lot of expectation. You know, it might generate enduring project work and solve problems, but the biggest benefit is this intrinsic freedom and play opportunity. Had another client that called this a snow day, right? Where if you happen to live in a cold climate, you know, when it snows, you're stuck at home. And so this is sort of a forced snow day. There, you can look up a lot of examples. Atlassian has a ship it day. They used to call it actually a FedEx day, but you know, FedEx maybe doesn't like that. Other people taking their name, but the idea was we need 24 hours to innovate. It's like 20% time on steroids, and the idea is like, how do you have something to sort of ship or deliver after that amount of time? Now, these are all about schedules and time and scheduling a certain amount of buffering. I want to give another quote from another great organizational scientist, Duke Ellington, who said, "Without a deadline, baby, I wouldn't do nothing." And I love this because as one of the great forefathers of jazz, you know, jazz is typically associated with improvisational styles and experimentation and being non-traditional. And all of that can mask the very technical discipline that sits underneath, right? I can't just pick up a piano and start to pound on it and make jazz. There is years of practice and schooling and developing of a technical discipline. And so all of that to me comes together in this kind of a thing where here is a jazz artist, right, who says, I need a deadline. And that just speaks to me in a way that's important. And so you need to have schedules and deadlines. You can't just say, go and invent and play. There needs to be something to help constrain the challenge that people are pursuing. And so some lessons from these programs. Number one, special allocations of time to work on or share ideas is important to step out of the day-to-day. The second is, how do you use these kinds of things to create buzz and stories in your organization? You know, things that get talked about and endure as symbols, really. It's symbolic of what your organization wants. It's symbolic of what your organization is driving towards. And these symbols represent the priorities and values and opportunities for leaders to reinforce these opportunities and values, right? What do you stand for? What are you trying to be as an organization? And how do you make that sort of the flavor of some of these programs that you do? This also gives you a common language and culture of innovation. As we started, innovation is kind of an inkblot test. It means different things to different people. But then with this too, there is a repetition and a rhythm that people can look forward to and participate in. And so if I were to step back from organizational structure or hack days or innovation competitions or blitz days or split time or anything like that, there's other kinds of techniques you can use. But really, it's not the specific program that's important, but getting in place something that touches upon this handful, these 5 points is really, I think, some of what's important here. All right. So I'm going to go for another poll here. Just a quick question. Of all these programs here, think about, you know, your own organization and maybe what you could do. If you had to pick one of these to implement today in your job, whatever it is, with whatever kind of innovation you deal with, what would you do? So give some thought. All right. Some people still mulling it over. Interesting. I suspect we're going to have a winner, but I'll give it just one more vote or two. All right. One more person will call it good. If you haven't voted, vote. This is interesting. All right. Closing the poll. Last chance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're good. All right. Sharing the results. Kind of split, but interestingly, the innovation competition was a little bit less. But split time or Blitz Day, Hack-a-Thon, each came up to about even. All right. Interesting. I think, again, the important is not the specific program, but it's, doing something that captures these kinds of lessons. All right. Jeff had mentioned, by the way, that at the end of each chapter in the book, there was a little evaluation. You don't actually have to buy the book. I know we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot here. You don't have to buy the book to find those. There is a website that's listed here that's ov-cvo.com, where we put up all of the little Quizlets from each chapter. And you could go there if you wanted and, answer the questions, and it scores you, gives you sort of green, yellow, red kinds of answers about each topic. And the Protecting Innovation chapter has questions. This is not exactly the wording of the questions, but this is the kind of thing that you're looking for. Like, how good are you at meeting your aspirations about current performance or future potential? Or do you really have the capacity, which was that harder normed item that we had, to act on promising new ideas? And do we get buffered from day-to-day concerns? And do we have, accountabilities and so forth that protect innovation time, yet keep it aligned with the business? And do we have, programs or something in place to help nurture all of this? So these are things you can think through, and things that might imply some tactics or abilities. But once you can check off all of these boxes, then you're doing a really good job. And I would love to talk to you and see what it is that you do. But as we're sort of starting to wrap up here, I think the overall message is that innovation needs your protection. It's tough, and it needs a buffer from the day-to-day. It won't often feel good or efficient. And sometimes cranking through execution, checking things off your list, that feels good. That feels efficient. And you have to step back and tolerate not feeling good or efficient and wading through murky waters in order to do this. And you will judge your learning along the way. If you've got worthy failures, if you are learning, and then eventual hits. But if you are a researcher at heart, you know that eventual hits is a very low base rate kind of outcome to predict, and it's tough. Science can be decidedly lacking when you've got outcomes that are very rare. But that's the way you have to judge your learning along the way, learning and worthy failures. Now, the bad news about all this stuff is that innovation is tough. Now, here's some good news. If it were easy, all of your competitors would be doing more of it. And so, in a way, this makes the trick. It's like, what is your innovation? How do you innovate? You want to innovate in ways that your customers or your competitors cannot. You want to innovate in order to create things that make it easy for you to meet needs in the marketplace and harder for your competitors to. Now, that's at an organizational level. That comes straight out of Michael Porter's sort of what is strategy kind of concepts. But you can apply this to your own work group. It's like, what is your purpose of your work group, and how do you innovate? And you can't innovate everything, so you just pick. It's like, what are the few things that will set you apart and create the value that you were put there to create? So with this, we are into about 15 minutes of possible questions and answers. As Jeff mentioned in the beginning, we were going to have this section of the program for you. And so you can ask questions in the little chat box. So I don't know, Jeff, if we've got any questions that have emerged already, but definitely everybody, if you've got questions or thoughts, bring them on.
There's a few we can start with, and let's start with this one here. If you just take a step back, and I'm reluctant to have you paint with too broad of a brush, but if you take a step back and you were to give organizations you're familiar with an A, B, C, or F on doing this kind of thing, protecting innovation, going after innovation the way you described, is there a grade you would assign organizations in general, or are they just really all over the map?
Well, let me give the boring answer, which is all over the map. There is a quality, which is that organizations that have succeeded for some number of time and are still in business, they have at least a passing grade, right? They probably aren't innovating in the ways that they want to or aspire to, and that's good. Your aspirations, if you're meeting your aspirations, then you need new aspirations. But I would also say that within any given organization, innovation is often all over the map, and because I think it speaks almost more to the human condition and so forth. I can map it to creating New Year's resolutions to do something new and different. Most New Year's resolutions, about half are deemed successful after 6 months. Is that a passing grade? Is that not a passing grade? I don't think you need a lot of innovation to stick in order for it to be really valuable, right? I think I would evaluate current performance and sort of execution things. You need maybe, and obviously it depends, but say 90% hit rates in order for that to be right and for that to be good. For innovation, if you have a 5% hit rate or even less, maybe that's enough. So the grading is hard, but the effort and the learning is where organizations, I think, need to focus.
So if you were a CEO of an organization and you weren't satisfied with the amount of innovation you saw going on in your company, what would be the first thing you would do?
The first thing I would do is make sure that I've got the right strategy in place that has enough of an expansive definition for what this organization is about, right? So how is it that we really want to innovate, and how are we going to separate from our competition if I'm in a for-profit organization? And I would have my vision, my strategy, my mission, whatever you want to call it, articulate pretty clearly how we're going to separate from the competition, and not in terms of tactics, right? Like we're going to separate by being, faster or manufacturing product X or whatever it is. But what are the competencies in the future that your organization will be better at, or you need to be better at? And that helps set up the frame for this connectedness to the top for where and how you might innovate. Now, when I'm saying this is for big picture innovation, organization innovation. But if I were, the head of HR or something like that, I might do the same kind of thing. It's like, how does our HR have to be different than other organizations' HR? And what's the nature of our talent pools? What's the nature of our growth? What's the nature of the culture we need to be? And how does that? How do we innovate on that? And that helps set a frame for how people can, develop new data tools or do whatever to set it up. So I think that's probably the first step. Maybe a longer answer than you expected, but I'd also add that if a CEO is satisfied with the level of innovation in his or her organization, I'd be surprised. I think CEOs are always trying to press and always should be trying to press. It's a fun
So
conversation.
follow up to that. Do you find that the way you would go about innovating, again, if you're running, whether it's a HR department or the total organization, the way you go about innovating, would it vary if you're a startup versus a mature organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you can think of a startup as 100% of developing future potential. Like, there are no systems, there are no existing approaches to doing things, and you're inventing everything. And so the proportion of creation and, sort of sweatier, playful, exploratory work is much higher than if you are, Walmart, right? Where, things need to work, things need to get shipped from here to there, and cash registers, can't be experimental. They need to actually collect money. So the ways people press will be different. And the little I innovation in a startup, there's not a lot of little I innovation because there's not a lot of existing stuff to streamline. So I mean, that's the short answer, is proportion, but that can have ripple effects into other sort of stylistic differences too.
So if you look at the little I versus the big I innovation, clearly the big I innovation is often viewed as these are the cutting edge people, these are the, this is the future of the company, and so forth. But how much, in a big company, talk a little bit about the benefits of little I and the potential increases in efficiency and cost savings and so forth from working away at the little I versus the big I.
Yeah. So you can kind of think about it, I mean, in a really, really rough sense. If the money you make is basically the revenue you get minus the costs to get there, big I innovation, in a way, is all about new sources of revenue. And streamlining current performance is kind of like cutting costs, right? Or getting to, keep more of your revenue. I mean, that's one way to sort of distinguish the two in a really, really big picture level. But it kind of helps. I mean, and it is reflective of working in the existing paradigm and, smart goals with costs and timelines and being faster and less waste. And, all of that is the little I, and all of that is reducing cost. But you can't you can't cut your way to competitive differentiation unless all you're about is being cheaper. But, the world changes too much for that to be sustainable over the long run. You can't just be the cheapest forever. Something has to innovate or be new in terms of getting new sources of revenue and new kinds of growth. So it's not exactly the right kind of parallel, but I think it's helpful as an answer to your question.
Okay, thanks. Here's a different topic, question on a different topic that just came in. What are some of the best ways to create a culture that accepts and is willing to try new ideas that are proposed by employees? In other words, how do you create a culture that revels in innovation? Yeah. Especially when it's suggested by the troops.
Yeah. Well, I think what is that culture? I mean that culture is not going to be just announced by the CEO and therefore we have it, right? One of my favorite definitions of culture is it's the stories that people tell when you're not in the room. And so, how do you create stories about ideas being used that are told by those employees from the front line? Well, if we have an ideas from everywhere kind of competition, that might help. Or if there is, the CEO stands at the front door every day and just shakes everybody's hand as they come in and give them a card. But, I mean, if I were working at a company with especially a famous CEO like Apple, if Tim Cook were at the front door when I was walking in every day, Now, Apple, of course, has 100 different locations, so that's not useful. But if he was just there, that would be huge, right? And so, I mean, you do what's feasible, but you try to do something and do something kind of big and audacious that has a repeatable rhythm, right? You can't just do something once and be done. But how do you create stories is one way to think about it. I think you can also have different kinds of training and different kinds of evaluations of what kind of people you hire and some other kinds of things that are all involved with creating culture. But if I were to keep my answer short-ish here, I would say find a way to create stories that sustainably tell themselves about people's ideas being used.
And I think we have time for just one final question. And then again, to remind everybody, please take a moment to complete our evaluation survey at the end. But Scott, in your mind, is there one best way to know to evaluate your organization in terms of are you innovative or not?
Yeah, well, there's obviously the innovation climate kind of thing that you can get through survey results, right? That help people understand and what the employees at large are feeling. I think if you were to look at measuring innovation, there's a lot of ways you can measure streamlining current performance, like the little I stuff. Cost savings, whatever. I mean, just go to your latest, find your nearest Six Sigma black belt, and they'll talk to you all about measurement. The measurement of building future potential is much more difficult, and there's actually a different chapter in the book that touches on some of these things. But the lightning summary of that is speed to learning, right? How fast can you learn something new? Because your innovation attempts are mostly going to fail, right? If we assume that. You can't measure by successes. You have to measure by, are we learning something? And then in retrospect, 5 years later, you can evaluate if something worked or not. But we can't wait that long to figure out if our innovation efforts are working. We have to put something in play that creates buzz, that creates learning, that gives us great failures to celebrate, that seem like they could have worked, should have worked, but just didn't happen to. But we're done in the right spirit. Sort of like measuring how well you're hacking your way through the Amazon if you don't have a map. It's like, I don't know. Are we making progress every day? Are we learning something about the landscape? And are we, generally developing the map as we go? It's tough. It's tough.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Scott, for what I thought was an informative webinar. And thank all the attendees for listening and contributing to the webinar. As I mentioned, there'll be a very brief little survey at the end, and you will get slides of the webinar once we conclude. Scott, any final words for the crowd?
Well, pick something and pitch it to your boss today, or think about what you might do in terms of some sort of innovation program, whether it's for your team or just for you. How will you structure buffer time to set aside from the day-to-day? How will you make sure that what you're pursuing is aligned with sort of what the charter or purpose of your group is? And how can you make it rhythmic and honor it? It's tough to do. It's tough to do, but good luck, and I'm confident.
So thank you, everybody, for attending, and look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye.